In the depths of the night, in the heart of the city, the artist's studio was a frozen storm of chaos. Splashes of vibrant paint covered the walls, the floor, even the ceiling, as though the very act of creation had erupted and then stilled in time. Half-finished canvases leaned precariously against every surface, their bold strokes screaming with untold stories. A single bulb flickered overhead, casting long, uneven shadows that seemed to breathe and shift in the silence. Detective Alex Ramsey stepped inside, his heavy boots thudding softly against the worn wooden floor. The air smelled of turpentine, linseed oil, and something faintly metallic, blood. Ramsey had seen many crime scenes in his years on the force, but this one felt different. There was a strange intimacy here, an unsettling sense that he had stepped not just into a murder scene, but into someone's soul. The victim lay near the center of the room, her body crumpled at the base of an easel. Eva Moreau, the renowned artist whose works had captivated the city, was now a lifeless form, her pale skin stark against the riot of color around her. A single, deliberate cut traced along her arm, precise and chilling in its simplicity. No signs of struggle, no chaotic marks of resistance, just this quiet, calculated violence. Ramsey crouched beside the body, his sharp eyes scanning her features. Even in death, Ava's face retained a haunting beauty, her expression caught somewhere between serenity and surprise. His gaze shifted to the easel behind her, where an unfinished painting loomed. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. Dark, violent strokes clashed against one another, creating a landscape of chaos and despair. The colors bled into one another like wounds refusing to heal. It wasn't just art, it was a scream, raw and visceral. Nearby, a torn photograph lay on the floor, partially covered by a smear of crimson paint. Ramsey reached for it, his gloved fingers brushing against the edge. The image showed Ava and another woman, their faces close, their smiles intimate. His pulse quickened, though he couldn't yet explain why. Something about the photograph, about the way they looked at each other, felt important. He slipped it into an evidence bag, already feeling the weight of the mystery pressing down on him. As he stood, his eyes swept over the room once more. The disarray of the studio was deceptive. This wasn't the chaos of a fight or a robbery gone wrong. It was the chaos of creation, left unfinished. Whoever had done this hadn't come for money or fame, they had come for Ava. Ramsey could feel it in his gut, the same way he always knew when a case was about to consume him. And this one already had its claws in deep. The next morning, Ramsey sat across from Elena Rousseau, Ava's girlfriend and a prominent art dealer. The interview room was cold and sterile, a stark contrast to the vibrant chaos of the studio. Elena was composed, her beauty sharp and polished like a diamond. But there was something guarded in her eyes, a wall she had built to keep the world at bay. "I was at home all night," she said, her voice steady but devoid of warmth. "Ava and we weren't in a good place lately. She was always working, always shutting me out. This new piece, she said it was her most important work yet. She wouldn't let me see it." Ramsey studied her, his expression unreadable. "Did she say why?" "No," Elena replied, her gaze dropping to her hands. "She was complicated. Passionate. Sometimes that passion turned into obsession. I think she was afraid of what people would see in it." "And what did you see in her?" Ramsey asked, his tone neutral but probing. Elena looked up sharply, her eyes flashing. "I loved her," she said, the words cutting through the air like a blade. But then her voice softened, almost breaking. I couldn't reach her anymore." Ramsey's eyes narrowed as he noticed something on her wrist, a faint smear of paint, barely visible against her pale skin. It was the same deep crimson that had dominated Ava's final canvas. He filed the detail away, his mind already turning over the possibilities. "You didn't go to the studio at all last night," he pressed. Elena shook her head, but there was a flicker of something, hesitation, perhaps, or guilt. "No," she said quietly. "I stayed home." Ramsey leaned back in his chair, letting the silence stretch. People often filled silence with truths they hadn't meant to share, but Elena held her ground, her expression unreadable once more. Still, he had seen enough to know she was hiding something. The question was, what? Back at the precinct, Ramsey handed the paint sample to the lab for analysis. It was a small detail, but he had learned long ago that small details often cracked cases wide open. He also began digging into Elena's past, looking for anything that might explain her relationship with Ava. The torn photograph from the crime scene lingered in his thoughts, the image of the unknown woman gnawing at him. Who was she? And what did she mean to Ava? When the lab results came back, confirming that the paint on Elena's wrist matched the pigment from Ava's studio, Ramsey felt a surge of vindication. But it wasn't enough. He needed more. He returned to Elena, this time armed with evidence. You were at the studio, he said, laying the lab report on the table between them. You lied. Elena's composure cracked, her hands trembling as she reached for the paper. I didn't kill her, she said, her voice breaking. I went there, yes, but not to hurt her. I wanted to talk. About what? Ramsey demanded. She was unraveling, Elena said, tears spilling down her cheeks. She was obsessed with something from her past. She wouldn't let it go. Ramsey's mind immediately went to the photograph. Who's the woman in the picture with Ava? Elena hesitated, her eyes widening slightly. Her sister, she said finally. Claire. The name sent a jolt through Ramsey. He hadn't known Ava had a sister, let alone one who might be connected to her death. His gut told him this was the thread he needed to pull. Claire Moreau's name led Ramsey down a rabbit hole of jealousy, resentment, and betrayal. A struggling artist in her own right, Claire had spent her life in Ava's shadow, her own work dismissed as derivative or mediocre. The bitterness between them was well documented, their sibling rivalry playing out in whispers among the art world's elite. But Claire wasn't just a failed artist. Her name was tied to a known art thief, a man who specialized in stealing and reselling high-value pieces. The connection was too significant to ignore. Ramsey tracked Claire to a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of the city, a far cry from the glitzy galleries her sister had frequented. Claire was waiting for him, or so it seemed. She leaned against the bar, a cigarette dangling from her fingers, her expression one of detached amusement. Detective Ramsey, she said, her voice dripping with mockery. To what do I owe the pleasure? Ramsey stepped closer, his eyes locking onto hers. Your sister's dead. Claire's smirk faltered, but only for a moment. I heard, she said, her tone softening. It's tragic. Is it? Ramsey asked, his voice cold. You hadn't seen her in years, isn't that right? Claire's jaw tightened. We weren't close, she admitted. But that doesn't mean I wanted her dead. Doesn't it? Ramsey shot back. Claire's eyes flashed with anger, but she didn't respond. Instead, she took a drag of her cigarette, exhaling slowly. Think what you want, detective, she said finally. I've got nothing to hide. But Ramsey knew better. The tattoo on her wrist, a broken rose with a single thorn, caught his attention. It was a symbol he'd seen before but couldn't yet place. He made a mental note to investigate it further. Back at the precinct, Ramsey dug into the meaning of the tattoo. What he uncovered shook him. It was the emblem of a secret society of artists, a group that believed death was the ultimate form of creation. Ava had been a member. So had Claire. And now, Ramsey was certain, so was Elena. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was darker than he had imagined. Ava's death wasn't just a murder, it was part of something much bigger, much more sinister. And Ramsey was determined to bring it all into the light. Ramsey stared at the scattered files on his desk, the photograph of Ava and Claire sitting on top like a taunt. The tattoo, the broken rose and thorn, was a lead he couldn't ignore, and as he dove deeper into its origins, the story that began to emerge was chilling. The secret society, known among its members as the Thorn Circle, was whispered about in the darker corners of the art world. Its members believed that true artistic creation required suffering, and in some cases, destruction. Their works were said to be raw, unfiltered, and often disturbing. What few knew was that some of these creations came at a cost far greater than canvas and paint. The link between Ava, Claire, and the society grew clearer as Ramsey pieced together their history. Ava, the celebrated artist, had been a rising star within the Thorn Circle, but she had distanced herself from them in recent years. Perhaps she had seen the group's philosophy for what it truly was, an excuse for dangerous obsession. Claire, on the other hand, had never been able to break free from the group's shadow and was rumored to still be involved. Ramsey couldn't shake the feeling that Ava's final painting held the key to everything. But what was she trying to say? And why had it cost her life? Later that evening, Ramsey returned to Ava's studio. The crime scene tape still fluttered in the wind as he ducked beneath it, stepping once more into the chaotic world she had left behind. The smell of paint and turpentine lingered, a ghost of her presence. He moved to the unfinished painting on the easel, studying it with new eyes. The violent strokes, the clashing colors, they seemed less random now. There was a pattern, though it was buried beneath layers of chaos. Ramsey leaned in closer, his fingers tracing the air just above the canvas. And then he saw it. Hidden within the swirling darkness of the painting was a symbol, a distorted version of the broken rose tattoo. It wasn't immediately apparent, but once he noticed it, he couldn't unsee it. The rose was fractured, its petals falling apart, but the thorn was sharp and intact, pointing downward. Beneath it, scrawled faintly in red paint, were the words, "The root of all pain." Ramsey's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a painting, it was a message. Ava had been trying to expose something, to warn someone. But who? And what did the cryptic phrase mean? He snapped a picture of the canvas and sent it to the precinct's forensic team for analysis. If there was more hidden in the layers of paint, he needed to know. His phone buzzed as he stepped outside. It was Officer Daniels, one of his more reliable colleagues. "Detective," Daniels said, his voice tense, "we've got something. A warehouse on the edge of town, it's linked to the Thorn Circle. Surveillance picked up someone matching Elena Rousseau's description entering it late last night." Ramsey's jaw tightened. Elena had lied to him again. The paint on her wrist, her evasive answers, her connection to Ava, it all pointed to her being deeply involved. And now she was leading him straight to the heart of this shadowy group. "Send me the address," Ramsey said, already heading to his car. The warehouse loomed in the distance, its rusted exterior blending into the industrial wasteland around it. Ramsey parked a block away, approaching on foot to avoid drawing attention. The air was heavy with the smell of oil and decay, and the faint hum of machinery buzzed in the background. He slipped through a side entrance, his footsteps silent as he moved through the dimly lit corridors. Inside, the warehouse was a labyrinth of half-constructed sculptures, shattered canvases, and broken tools. It was as though the artists who worked here had been consumed by their own madness, their creations abandoned mid-birth. Ramsey's heart pounded as he moved deeper into the space, the faint sound of voices guiding him. He stopped just outside a large room, peering through a crack in the door. Elena stood in the center, her back to him. She was speaking to a group of people, their faces obscured by the dim light. On the floor before them was a massive canvas, its surface marked with symbols and phrases that Ramsey couldn't decipher. At the center of the canvas was another rose, this one fully intact and painted in blood-red strokes. It was the opposite of the broken rose tattoo, a symbol of completion rather than destruction. "This is the culmination of everything," Elena was saying, her voice filled with fervor. "Ava thought she could destroy us, but instead, she gave us the final piece. Her death will fuel our greatest work yet." Ramsey's stomach turned. It was a confession, but it was more than that. Elena wasn't just a participant, she was a leader. And whatever work she was talking about, it wasn't finished. He reached for his radio to call for backup, but the slight crackle of static gave him away. Elena's head snapped around, her eyes locking on his through the gap in the door. "Detective Ramsey," she said, her voice dripping with mock surprise. "I was wondering when you'd catch up." The group turned to face him, their expressions a mix of curiosity and menace. Ramsey stepped into the room, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. "It's over, Elena," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "I know what you've done. I know about Ava, about the society. You're not walking out of here." Elena smiled, a cold, calculating smile that sent a chill down his spine. "You think you figured it out?" she asked, taking a step closer. "You don't even know the half of it." Before Ramsey could respond, the lights in the warehouse flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The sound of footsteps echoed around him, and he drew his gun, his senses on high alert. "Stay where you are," he shouted, his voice cutting through the quiet. But the group scattered, their movements swift and deliberate. Ramsey's flashlight cut through the darkness, catching glimpses of figures disappearing into the shadows. He moved cautiously, his weapon raised, but the warehouse was a maze, and the darkness was their ally. By the time backup arrived, the room was empty, save for the haunting canvas on the floor. The aftermath was a blur of frustration and determination. Elena and her accomplices had vanished, but Ramsey knew this wasn't the end. The painting was seized as evidence, its cryptic symbols and phrases analyzed by experts. Slowly, the pieces of the Thorn Circle's plan began to emerge. It wasn't just about art or power, it was about control. Through their work, they sought to manipulate and dominate, using fear and fascination to bend others to their will. Ramsey's investigation continued, but the case took its toll. The deeper he delved, the more he realized how far-reaching the society's influence was. Ava's death was just the beginning, a spark that had ignited a much larger fire. And as Ramsey stood in his office late one night, staring at the photograph of Ava and Claire, he couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness he was fighting against wasn't just out there, it was creeping into his own soul. The following weeks felt like a relentless blur for Detective Alex Ramsey. The tangled web of the Thorn Circle unraveled slowly, each thread revealing more questions than answers. Elena Rousseau and her accomplices had vanished into the city's shadows, leaving behind only fragments of their sinister philosophy and the eerie painting found on the warehouse floor. Ramsey couldn't shake the feeling that he was always one step behind them, chasing ghosts through a labyrinth of secrets. The painting, now locked away in the evidence room, haunted him. Its cryptic symbols and phrases seemed to mock him, their meaning just out of reach. Forensic analysis had revealed layers upon layers of paint, each one concealing something beneath it. Experts spent days peeling back those layers, uncovering more symbols, more words, and more darkness. At the very bottom of it all, hidden beneath the chaotic imagery, was a single name scrawled in faint black ink: Claire. Ramsey's heart sank when he saw it. He had tried to track Ava's estranged sister after their brief encounter at the bar, but she had disappeared. Now it was clear she wasn't just another thread in this case, she was central to it. Ramsey's gut told him that Claire hadn't just been a passive observer in Ava's life or death. She was tied to the Thorn Circle in ways he had yet to comprehend. Determined to find her, Ramsey delved into Claire's history. He learned that after years of struggling in the shadow of her sister, Claire had left the city entirely, traveling to Europe to study under controversial mentors known for their extreme views on art and suffering. She had returned a few years ago, but her reappearance had been quiet, almost invisible. There were no galleries showcasing her work, no interviews or public appearances. It was as though she had chosen to vanish even while living among the city's bustling streets. Ramsey's investigation eventually led him to a rundown building in a forgotten corner of the city. It was an artist's commune, a place where struggling creatives lived and worked in exchange for helping maintain the space. Claire's name appeared on the lease records, but when Ramsey arrived, the residents claimed she had left weeks ago. They spoke of her in hushed tones, their words tinged with fear. One young man, his hands stained with charcoal, hesitated before speaking. She was strange, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She talked about things that didn't make sense. About how art could change people, control them. She said it was all connected to something bigger, something ancient. Did she mention the Thorn Circle? Ramsey asked, his tone sharp. The man flinched, his eyes darting nervously around the room. I don't know what that is, he said quickly. But she was always drawing this symbol. He grabbed a scrap of paper from a nearby table and sketched a rough version of the broken rose tattoo. She said it was the key to everything. Ramsey pocketed the sketch and left the commune, his mind racing. Claire was clearly still in the city, and she was still working on something. But what? And why was she running from him if she wasn't directly involved in Ava's death? The break in the case came unexpectedly, as these things often did. Officer Daniels called Ramsey late one night, his voice tinged with urgency. "We found her," he said simply. "Claire?" Ramsey asked, already grabbing his coat. "Yeah. She's at a hospital downtown. Someone found her unconscious in an alley. Looks like an overdose, but the doctors say she'll pull through." Ramsey's chest tightened as he drove to the hospital. He didn't know what he would find or how much Claire would be willing to tell him. But this was his chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. When he arrived, Claire was lying in a hospital bed, her face pale and gaunt. The room smelled of antiseptic, and the steady beep of the heart monitor filled the silence. She opened her eyes as he entered, her gaze bleary but sharp. "Detective Ramsey," she murmured, her voice weak but laced with bitterness. "Come to gloat?" "I'm not here to gloat," Ramsey said, pulling up a chair beside her bed. "I'm here to get answers." Claire laughed softly, a hollow sound that made Ramsey's skin crawl. "Answers," she repeated. "You think there are answers to any of this?" "There are always answers," Ramsey said firmly. "What happened to Ava? What is the Thorn Circle planning? And where does Elena fit into all of this?" At the mention of Elena's name, Claire's expression darkened. "Elena," she spat. "She thinks she's the queen of it all. But she doesn't understand. None of them do." "Understand what?" Ramsey pressed. "Help me understand." Claire hesitated, her eyes searching his face. For a moment, Ramsey thought she might shut down completely, but then she sighed. "Ava was trying to stop them," she said finally. "She was trying to destroy the circle from the inside. That's why she painted it." "Painted what?" Ramsey asked. "The map," Claire said, her voice growing fainter. "The painting you found, it's a map. To their sanctuary." "Sanctuary?" Ramsey repeated, his pulse quickening. "They call it the Root," Claire said. "It's where it all began. It's where they create their masterpieces. And it's where they were going to take Ava's final work." Ramsey leaned closer. "Where is it?" Claire's lips trembled, and for a moment he thought she might refuse to answer. But then she whispered a single word, Briarwood. Briarwood was a desolate stretch of forest on the outskirts of the city, long abandoned and overgrown. The name sent a chill through Ramsey. It was the perfect place for a group like the Thorn Circle to operate in secret. Armed with Claire's information, he assembled a team and prepared for a raid. As they approached the forest under the cover of night, Ramsey couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, and the moonlight barely pierced through the dense canopy of trees. The team moved silently, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they followed the faint trail Claire had described. The path led them to a clearing where an old, crumbling mansion loomed like a ghost. Its windows were shattered, its walls covered in ivy, but there was no mistaking it. This was the Root. Ramsey signaled for his team to spread out, their weapons drawn as they approached the building. Inside, the mansion was a maze of decaying rooms and secret passages. The air was heavy with the smell of mildew and something else, something metallic. Ramsey's heart raced as they moved deeper into the structure, the faint sound of murmured voices growing louder with each step. They found the group in the mansion's grand hall, gathered around a massive altar draped in blood-red fabric. Elena stood at the center, her arms raised as she addressed the crowd. "Tonight," she proclaimed, "we complete what Ava could not. Tonight, her sacrifice will bring us the ultimate creation." Ramsey didn't wait for her to finish. "Police," he shouted, his voice echoing through the hall. "Everyone freeze." The room erupted into chaos. Members of the circle scattered, some trying to flee while others lunged at the officers. Ramsay moved toward Elena, his gun trained on her as she backed away from the altar. "It's over, Elena," he shouted. But Elena only smiled. "You can't stop this," she said. "It's already begun." Before Ramsay could respond, the lights in the mansion flickered and went out, plunging them all into darkness. The darkness consumed the room, a suffocating void that seemed to swallow sound. For a moment, all Ramsay could hear was the pounding of his own heart and the chaotic shuffle of footsteps around him. He gripped his flashlight tightly, its beam cutting through the blackness like a weak blade. Shouts echoed through the grand hall, his team calling out to one another, trying to regain control of the situation. "Elena!" Ramsay barked, his voice reverberating off the cold stone walls. But there was no reply, only the sound of hurried movement retreating deeper into the mansion. He pushed forward, the beam of his flashlight sweeping over the altar. The red fabric Elena had stood before moments ago was now empty, save for a ceremonial dagger and a strange sculpture. Ramsay's stomach churned as he studied the object, a twisted amalgamation of human and floral forms, the broken rose motif carved into its base. Blood, fresh and glistening, stained its surface, dripping slowly onto the floor. Whatever ritual Elena had been performing, it wasn't over. "Ramsay, over here," a voice called out from the left. It was Daniels, his flashlight bobbing in the darkness as he approached. "She's heading downstairs. There's a hidden passage." Ramsay nodded sharply, motioning for Daniels to follow as he moved toward the entrance to the passage, a narrow staircase descending into the bowels of the mansion. The air grew colder with every step, the walls damp and claustrophobic. Faint whispers seemed to echo around them, an eerie chorus that Ramsay couldn't tell was real or imagined. At the bottom of the staircase, the passage opened into a cavernous underground chamber. The flashlight's beam revealed grotesque sculptures lining the walls, their forms warped and unnatural, as though the artists had been trying to capture torment itself. At the center of the chamber stood Elena, her silhouette framed by the dim glow of candles arranged in a circular pattern. Around her were several members of the Thorn Circle, their faces obscured by masks bearing the broken rose emblem. "You can't stop this, Detective," Elena said, her voice calm despite the chaos above. "Ava tried, and look where it got her. This is bigger than you, bigger than any of us. Drop whatever you're holding and step away." Ramsay commanded, his gun trained on her. He could see she was clutching something in her hands, a small vial filled with a dark, viscous liquid. Elena smirked, raising the vial so it caught the light. "Do you know what this is?" she asked. "It's the essence of creation. Pain. Suffering. Sacrifice. Ava used it in her final work, and now it's ours. With this, we'll finish what she couldn't." Ramsay stepped closer, his finger tightening on the trigger. "You're not finishing anything. Drop it. Now." But Elena merely laughed, a sound that sent shivers down Ramsay's spine. "You don't understand, do you? You're trying to fight something eternal. Something inevitable." Before Ramsay could react, Elena hurled the vial to the floor. It shattered on impact, the dark liquid spreading across the stone like ink. The room seemed to vibrate, a low, resonant hum filling the air. The candles flickered wildly, their flames stretching unnaturally high. Ramsay's instincts screamed at him to act, but before he could move, the ground beneath his feet trembled. The sculptures lining the chamber walls began to shift, their grotesque forms twisting and contorting as though coming to life. Ramsay's breath caught as one of the figures turned its head toward him, its hollow eyes glowing faintly. It was impossible, stone didn't move, didn't breathe, but here it was, animated by some unseen force. "Daniels, fall back!" Ramsay shouted, his voice barely audible over the growing hum. He fired a warning shot at one of the figures, but the bullet ricocheted harmlessly off its surface. Elena stood at the center of the chaos, her arms raised as she chanted in a language Ramsay didn't recognize. The other members of the Thorn Circle joined in, their voices blending into a haunting, discordant melody. Ramsey's flashlight flickered, its beam growing weaker as the chamber seemed to pulse with energy. Enough! Ramsey bellowed, charging toward Elena. He tackled her to the ground, her chanting cut off by the force of the impact. The chanting from the others faltered, and the humming vibration in the room began to subside. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Elena struggled beneath him, her eyes wild. "You don't understand," she screamed. "Stopping me won't stop it. It's already begun." Ramsey ignored her protests, pulling her hands behind her back and securing them with his cuffs. "You're done," he said through gritted teeth. "This ends now." As he dragged her to her feet, the other members of the Thorn Circle began to retreat, disappearing into the shadows of the chamber's many passageways. Daniels appeared at Ramsey's side, his face pale but determined. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," Ramsey admitted. "But it's over. At least for now." The aftermath was chaotic. Elena was taken into custody, though she refused to speak further, her defiant silence only deepening the mystery. The mansion and its subterranean chambers were sealed off as a crime scene, and every artifact, sculpture, and document found within was catalogued and analyzed. The ritual had been interrupted, but its purpose remained unclear. Ramsey knew one thing for certain: the Thorn Circle wasn't finished. Not yet. In the days that followed, Ramsey couldn't shake the images of that night, the shifting sculptures, the chanting, the vial of dark liquid. He pored over the evidence, searching for answers, but the pieces refused to fit together. Claire, still recovering in the hospital, offered little help. She claimed to know nothing about the ritual or its purpose, insisting that she had been trying to escape the group, not aid them. Despite the loose ends, Ramsey found some solace in knowing that Elena was behind bars, her influence over the group temporarily severed. But as he sat alone in his office late one night, staring at Ava's final painting, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had only scratched the surface of something far more sinister. The broken rose, the cryptic symbols, the haunting words, the root of all pain, they lingered in his mind, an unsolved riddle that refused to let him rest. And then, just as he was about to leave for the night, his phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. The message contained only a single line. "You stopped nothing. The root grows deeper." The message sent a shiver down Ramsey's spine. He stared at the words glowing on his phone screen, his mind racing. The root grows deeper. It wasn't just a taunt, it was a promise. The Thorn Circle was still out there, regrouping, and whatever they were planning next would be more dangerous than anything he'd faced so far. Ramsey didn't have the luxury of waiting for their next move. He needed to strike first. He traced the number, but it was a dead end, a burner phone, untraceable. Whoever had sent the message had planned it well. Ramsey leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. The painting sat on his desk, the photograph of Ava and Claire pinned beside it. The symbols in the painting still haunted him, their meaning elusive, their arrangement deliberate. Every time he stared at the canvas, he felt like he was on the edge of understanding something monumental, but it always slipped through his fingers. The next morning, Ramsey returned to the evidence room. The painting had been analyzed, photographed, and catalogued, but he needed to see it again in person. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, the colors seemed even more chaotic than before, the dark reds and blacks clashing violently with streaks of yellow and white. But as Ramsey studied it, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. In the bottom corner, nearly hidden beneath layers of paint, was another faint inscription. It wasn't in English. He snapped a photo and sent it to a linguist on the force, someone who specialized in decoding symbols and ancient languages. Within an hour, Ramsey had his answer. The inscription was in Latin, and it read, Radix omnium dolorum. The root of all pain. Ramsey's stomach twisted. The phrase wasn't just a cryptic warning, it was a direct reference to something. But what? He needed more information. He spent hours poring over records, searching for any mention of the Thorn Circle's activities, their beliefs, or their leaders. One name kept surfacing, Alaric Voss. Voss was a reclusive art historian and collector, infamous for his obsession with the macabre. He had written extensively about art's connection to suffering and had been linked to several underground movements, though nothing had ever been proven. His name appeared in connection with Eva Moreau several years ago, around the time she had first distanced herself from the Thorn Circle. If anyone could shed light on the group's origins and intentions, it was him. The drive to Voss's estate took Ramsey out of the city and into the countryside. The road wound through dense forests, the trees growing taller and more oppressive with each passing mile. When he finally arrived, the estate loomed before him like something out of a Gothic novel. The mansion was massive, its stone facade weathered and covered in creeping vines. Statues of distorted, anguished figures lined the driveway, their faces frozen in silent screams. Ramsey rang the bell, the chime echoing hollowly inside. A moment later, the door creaked open, and an elderly man with sharp features and piercing blue eyes stepped into view. He was dressed impeccably, his demeanor cold and formal. "Detective Ramsey, I presume," Voss said, his voice low and measured. "I've been expecting you." Ramsey blinked, caught off guard. "You have?" Voss's lips curved into a thin smile. "Word travels fast in certain circles, detective. Please, come in." The interior of the mansion was just as unsettling as the exterior. The walls were lined with paintings, each one more disturbing than the last. Ramsey recognized some of the artists, Ava's name among them, but many were unfamiliar. The pieces all shared a common theme: suffering, chaos, and despair, rendered in exquisite detail. Voss led Ramsey to a study, its walls lined with books that looked centuries old. A large desk sat in the center, cluttered with papers, sketches, and strange artifacts. Voss gestured for Ramsey to sit before settling into his own chair. "You're here about the Thorn Circle," Voss said, his tone matter-of-fact. Ramsey nodded. "You know about them." "Know about them?" Voss chuckled darkly. "I was one of their founders." The revelation hit Ramsey like a punch to the gut. He leaned forward, his voice sharp. "Then you know what they're planning." "I know enough," Voss replied, his expression unreadable. The circle was never meant to become what it is today. It was supposed to be a movement, a way to explore the connection between pain and creation. But over the years, it evolved. Or rather, it devolved. Into what? Ramsey pressed. Voss sighed, his gaze distant. Into a cult. A group of fanatics who believe that suffering isn't just a means to creation, it's an end in itself. They worship it. They crave it. And they'll do anything to achieve it. "What about Ava?" Ramsey asked. "And Claire? How do they fit into all of this?" "Ava was one of the brightest stars the Circle had ever seen," Voss said, his voice tinged with regret. "Her work was raw, powerful, untainted by the dogma that consumed the others. But when she realized what the Circle was becoming, she tried to leave. They didn't take it well." "And Claire?" Ramsey asked. "Claire," Voss hesitated. "Claire was always in Ava's shadow. She wanted what Ava had, her talent, her fame, her freedom. The Circle saw that and used it against her. They promised her everything she ever wanted, but it came at a cost." Ramsey's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of the story. "What about the phrase? The root of all pain. What does it mean?" Voss's expression darkened. "It's the Circle's ultimate goal. They believe that there is a source, a singular, primal root of all human suffering. They think that if they can find it, tap into it, they can unlock a kind of divine power. Ava's final painting, it was their map to finding it." Ramsey's breath caught. "And where is this root supposed to be?" Voss leaned back in his chair, his eyes cold. "Briarwood was only the beginning. The root isn't a place, detective. It's an idea. A force. And if the Circle succeeds in unleashing it, the world will never be the same." Ramsey left Voss's estate with more questions than answers. The idea of a root of all pain seemed abstract, almost impossible to believe. But he couldn't ignore the evidence. The thorn circle was real, their power was growing, and Ava's death had been a key step in their plan. If they succeeded in completing her final work, there was no telling what they might unleash. As he drove back to the city, his phone buzzed again. Another message, this time with an attachment. The text read, "You're running out of time." The attachment was a photo of a new painting, one Ramsey had never seen before. It depicted a tree, its roots spreading deep into the earth, each one wrapped around a screaming face. At the base of the tree was the broken rose. Ramsey's hands tightened on the wheel. The circle wasn't done with him yet. And this time, they were inviting him to watch. The photograph of the painting burned in Ramsey's mind as he sped back toward the city. The grotesque image of the tree, its roots entwined with anguished faces, felt more like a threat than a work of art. The broken rose at its base was a clear signature of the thorn circle, a chilling reminder that they were still operating in the shadows, moving forward with their plans. The message, "You're running out of time," wasn't just a taunt. It was a warning. Ramsey forwarded the photo to the precinct's forensic team, instructing them to analyze the image for any clues about its origin. He also sent it to Claire, who was still recovering in the hospital. If anyone could decipher its meaning, it was her. But Ramsey couldn't wait for answers. He needed to act now. The precinct was a flurry of activity when Ramsey arrived. Officer Daniels met him at the entrance, his expression grim. "We've got a lead," he said, handing Ramsey a file. One of the analysts recognized the painting in the photo. It matches the style of a reclusive artist named Victor Hale. He's known for creating grotesque, symbolic works, stuff that's been linked to the thorn circle in the past. "Where can I find him?" Ramsey asked, flipping through the file. "He has a workshop in an abandoned factory on the east side of the city," Daniels replied. "But there's more. The painting in the photo? It's new. Hale hasn't exhibited any work publicly in years. If this is his, it means he's still active, and he's working with the circle." Ramsey nodded, already heading toward the door. "Get a team ready," he said. "We're going in tonight." The factory loomed like a monolith against the night sky, its windows shattered, its walls covered in graffiti. Ramsey and his team approached cautiously, their footsteps echoing on the cracked pavement. The air was thick with the smell of oil and decay, and the distant hum of machinery suggested that the building wasn't as abandoned as it seemed. Inside, the factory was a maze of rusted equipment and debris. Ramsey signaled for his team to spread out, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The further they moved in, the more unsettling the surroundings became. The walls were covered in strange murals, images of twisted faces, broken bodies, and symbols that Ramsey recognized from Ava's painting. It was as though the factory itself had been transformed into a shrine to suffering. "Over here," Daniels called, his voice low. Ramsey followed the sound, his flashlight revealing a staircase leading down into the basement. The air grew colder as they descended, the walls narrowing into a claustrophobic passage. At the bottom, they found Hale's workshop. The room was vast, its walls lined with canvases depicting horrors that made even Ramsey's hardened stomach churn. In the center of the room stood the tree from the photograph, its roots carved into the concrete floor, each face screaming in silent agony. Hale was there, hunched over a new canvas, his hands moving feverishly as he painted. "Victor Hale." Ramsey barked, his gun trained on the artist. "Step away from the easel and put your hands where I can see them." Hale froze, his paintbrush hovering mid-stroke. Slowly, he turned to face them. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, but there was a spark of something, defiance, perhaps, or madness. "You're too late," he said, his voice rasping like dry leaves. "It's already begun." "What's begun?" Ramsey demanded, stepping closer. "What's the circle planning?" Hale smiled, a brittle, unsettling smile. "You think you can stop it? You can't. The root is alive. It's always been alive. And now, we've given it the nourishment it needs to grow. Ramsey's jaw tightened. What are you talking about? What is the root? Hale gestured to the tree on the floor, his bony fingers trembling. It's everything, he said. Pain, fear, suffering, they feed it. They make it stronger. Ava understood that. That's why she tried to destroy it. But she failed. And now, it's too late. Before Ramsey could respond, Hale lunged for a knife on the table beside him. Daniels reacted instantly, tackling the artist to the ground. The knife clattered to the floor, and Hale let out a guttural scream, thrashing beneath Daniels' weight. You can't stop it, he howled. You'll only make it stronger. As Hale was restrained, Ramsey's attention turned back to the tree. Something about it felt wrong, almost alive. The faces carved into its roots seemed to shift when he looked away, their expressions twisting in agony. He shook his head, forcing himself to focus. It was just a sculpture. It had to be. Back at the precinct, Hale refused to talk. He sat in the interrogation room, his hands cuffed to the table, staring blankly at the wall. Ramsey watched him through the one-way mirror, frustration boiling in his chest. Hale was the closest thing they had to a lead, but he wasn't giving them anything. Claire's voice broke through his thoughts. He won't tell you anything, she said, stepping into the observation room. Ramsey turned to face her, surprised to see her out of the hospital. You shouldn't be here, he said. You're not ready for this. Claire shook her head, her expression resolute. I'm the only one who can help you. Hale's not going to talk because he doesn't need to. Everything you need to know is in the painting. Ramsey frowned. What are you talking about? Claire gestured to the sketch of the tree, which was pinned to the evidence board. The tree, the roots, the faces, it's a map. Not a physical one, but a symbolic one. It's showing you where to look. And where is that? Ramsey asked, his patience wearing thin. Claire hesitated, her eyes flickering with fear. Within yourself, she said finally. The root isn't just a place. It's a state of being. The circle believes it's inside all of us, buried deep, feeding on our pain. If you want to stop them, you have to confront it. You have to go where they're taking this. Ramsey's chest tightened. And where are they taking it? Claire's gaze dropped to the floor. To the final work. The ultimate creation. They're going to unveil it at the Vernal Solstice Festival. The festival was one of the city's largest gatherings, a celebration of art and culture that drew thousands of people every year. Ramsey's blood ran cold as he realized what Claire was saying. The circle wasn't just planning to finish Ava's work, they were planning to use it to unleash something horrific on an unimaginable scale. As the Vernal Solstice Festival approached, Ramsey and his team worked around the clock to prepare. They coordinated with festival organizers, set up surveillance, and placed undercover officers throughout the event. But the closer the date came, the more Ramsey felt the weight of the message he had received. The root grows deeper. This wasn't just about stopping the Thorn Circle anymore. It was about understanding their philosophy, their obsession with pain, and the power they believed it held. Ramsey knew that if he didn't figure out their endgame, he wouldn't just fail to stop them, he might become part of the suffering they sought to create. The Vernal Solstice Festival arrived with all the grandeur and excitement that the city had come to expect. Streets were alive with lights, music, and throngs of people moving from gallery to gallery, admiring the installations and performances. But for Detective Alex Ramsey, the festival was no celebration. It was a battlefield. The festival grounds sprawled across several city blocks, with art exhibits scattered throughout. Ramsey's team had set up checkpoints and surveillance stations at key locations, but the sheer size of the event made it impossible to monitor everything. The Thorn Circle had chosen their battleground well. If they were planning something catastrophic, this was the perfect stage. Ramsey stood in the command center, a makeshift setup in a nearby parking garage, scanning the live feeds from the festival. Officers in plain clothes moved through the crowds, their earpieces crackling with updates. He had briefed his team on what to look for: symbols, suspicious behavior, anything tied to the circle's imagery. But the problem was, art festivals were supposed to be strange. The boundaries between the bizarre and the sinister were razor thin. Nothing unusual so far, Officer Daniels reported, stepping up beside Ramsey. Just the usual pretentious installations and overpriced sculptures. Ramsey nodded, but his gut told him otherwise. The circle wouldn't have gone to these lengths for nothing. They were here, somewhere, and they were waiting for the right moment. As the night stretched on, Ramsey's phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. His stomach dropped as he read the message. The unveiling begins at midnight. The roots will bloom. The text came with a photo, a blurry image of a large, covered sculpture in the center of a gallery tent. The tarp draped over it was marked with the familiar broken rose symbol. Ramsey's pulse quickened. This was it. He called Daniels over. "We've got a location," he said, showing him the photo. "Gallery Tent C, get everyone there now." The tent was tucked away in a quieter corner of the festival grounds, its location almost deliberately understated. Ramsey approached cautiously, his weapon concealed under his jacket. The area was unusually quiet, the crowd thinning as midnight approached. He spotted Claire standing near the entrance, her face pale and tight with anxiety. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low. "I had to come," Claire replied, her voice trembling. "If they're unveiling Ava's final work, I need to see it. I need to understand." Ramsey hesitated but knew there was no time to argue. "Stay close to me," he ordered, pushing through the tent's flaps. Inside, the space was dimly lit, the air heavy with the scent of paint and turpentine. The centerpiece of the tent was unmistakable, the massive, tarp-covered sculpture from the photo. Around it, a small crowd had gathered, their faces obscured by masks bearing the broken rose emblem. At the front of the group stood Elena Rousseau. "Elena!" Ramsey barked, drawing his gun. "Step away from the sculpture." Elena turned slowly, her expression serene. "Ah, Detective Ramsey," she said, her voice calm. "You're just in time. I was hoping you'd join us for the unveiling." The masked figures turned toward Ramsey, their movements eerily synchronized. He glanced around, his grip tightening on his weapon. The tension in the room was suffocating. "This ends now," Ramsey said, stepping closer. "Whatever you're planning, it stops here." Elena laughed softly, a sound that sent chills down Ramsey's spine. "You still don't understand, do you?" she said. "This isn't something you can stop. This is art. This is truth. And tonight, the world will see it." With that, she turned and yanked the tarp from the sculpture. The room seemed to gasp as the sculpture was revealed. It was the tree from the photographs, but now it was complete. The roots twisted violently, their carved faces contorted in agony. The broken rose motif was embedded in its trunk, glowing faintly as though lit from within. But what struck Ramsey most was the top of the sculpture, a figure that resembled Ava, her face frozen in a blend of torment and serenity, her arms outstretched as though in surrender. The crowd began to murmur, their voices rising in awe and reverence. Elena stepped back, her arms raised. "Behold," she said, her voice ringing through the tent. "The root of all pain. The culmination of our work. The ultimate creation." Ramsey's instincts screamed at him to act, but he was momentarily paralyzed by the sheer presence of the sculpture. It was more than art, it felt alive. The air around it seemed to pulse, a low vibration that resonated in his chest. He glanced at Claire, whose face was pale and tear-streaked. "This is wrong," Claire whispered. "This isn't what Ava wanted." Ramsey's focus snapped back to Elena. "Shut it down," he shouted, stepping forward. "Whatever you've done, stop it now." But Elena only smiled. "It's too late," she said. "The root is awake." The tent erupted into chaos. The vibrations intensified, the walls shuddering as though the earth itself were responding to the sculpture. The masked figures began to chant, their voices blending into a haunting, discordant melody. Ramsey raised his gun, aiming at the sculpture, but hesitated. If it really was connected to something greater, would destroying it make things worse? Daniels, get everyone out of here. Ramsey shouted into his radio. Evaluate the festival grounds. The chanting grew louder, the vibrations spreading through the floor. Ramsey turned to Claire. Do you know how to stop this? He demanded. Claire shook her head, panic in her eyes. I don't know. Ava never. Before she could finish, one of the masked figures lunged at Ramsey. He fired instinctively, the shot ringing out and sending the figure crumpling to the ground. The crowd scattered, some running for the exits while others rushed toward the sculpture as though trying to protect it. Elena stood unmoving, her gaze fixed on the tree. You can't stop it, she said, her voice almost reverent. The root has already taken hold. Ramsey pushed forward, shoving through the chaos until he reached the base of the sculpture. The glowing rose at its center seemed to pulse in time with the vibrations, its light intensifying with each passing second. Without thinking, Ramsey grabbed the ceremonial dagger from Elena's hand and plunged it into the rose. For a moment, everything stopped. The vibration ceased, and the room fell deathly silent. The glowing rose flickered, its light dimming, and the faces in the roots seemed to slacken, their expressions softening. Elena let out a scream, lunging toward Ramsey, but he caught her wrist and shoved her back. It's over, he said, his voice firm. But even as he spoke, he felt a chill run through him. The sculpture might have been silenced, but the darkness it represented was still there, lingering, waiting. Elena was restrained and taken into custody, along with several other members of the Thorn Circle. The festival was evaluated, the tent sealed off as a crime scene. But as Ramsey stood outside, watching the flashing lights of police cars and ambulances, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The root might have been severed, but its shadow remained. The aftermath of the Vernal Solstice Festival left a scar on the city. News of the mysterious evacuation spread quickly, and rumors ran wild. Some whispered about a failed terrorist attack, while others speculated about an avant-garde performance gone horribly wrong. The authorities kept the details under wraps, but for Detective Ramsey, the weight of what had transpired was far heavier than any public speculation. The sculpture had been transported to a secure facility for further analysis, along with every piece of evidence collected from the gallery tent. Ramsey wasn't sure what the forensic team would find, or if he even wanted to know. The memory of the glowing rose, the pulsing vibrations, and the eerie chanting haunted him, playing on a loop in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that they had only delayed the inevitable. Elena Rousseau sat in an interrogation room, her hands cuffed to the table, her face calm despite everything that had happened. Ramsey stood behind the one-way mirror, watching her with a mix of frustration and unease. She hadn't spoken a word since her arrest, her silence as unnerving as her earlier proclamations. Daniel stepped into the observation room, holding a folder. We've gone through everything we found at the tent, he said. Sketches, journals, even some digital files. It's all cryptic, but one thing's clear, they're not done. Ramsey sighed, rubbing his temples. What about the sculpture? Did the forensics team find anything? Daniels hesitated. They're still working on it, but there's something strange. They can't explain the glow from the rose. There's no power source, no chemical reaction that would account for it. It's like, he stopped, searching for the words. Like it's alive, Ramsey finished grimly. Daniels nodded. Yeah. Something like that. Ramsey turned back to the mirror, his gaze fixed on Elena. He couldn't let her sit there in silence any longer. Steeling himself, he entered the interrogation room and sat across from her. Elena, he began, his tone firm but measured. You can't keep hiding behind your silence. You've lost. The sculpture is in our custody. The circle is fractured. Whatever you were trying to achieve, it's over. Elena's lips twitched into a faint smile. You think we've lost, she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. You think you've won? You're behind bars, Ramsey replied. Your followers are scattered. I'd call that a win. Elena chuckled, a low, unsettling sound. You still don't understand, she said, leaning forward. The root isn't something you can contain. It's not something you can destroy. It's in you, detective. It's in all of us. Ramsey's jaw tightened. What does that even mean? Enough with the cryptic nonsense. Tell me what the circle's endgame is. Elena's eyes seemed to glint with something, amusement, perhaps, or pity. The endgame, she repeated. There is no endgame. The root is eternal. It grows with every fear, every pain, every loss. All we've done is show you the truth. And now, you're part of it. Ramsey felt a chill run through him, but he refused to let it show. You're not scaring me, Elena, he said. Whatever power you think the circle has, it's over. We stopped it. Stopped it? Elena said, tilting her head. You didn't stop anything. You only pruned a branch. The root grows deeper, detective. It always does. After hours of interrogation, Ramsey left the precinct feeling no closer to the answers he needed. Elena's words lingered in his mind, gnawing at him. The root is eternal. It grows with every fear, every pain, every loss. He returned to his apartment, desperate for rest but unable to sleep. The events of the past few weeks played through his mind: Ava's cryptic painting, Claire's tears, the haunting sculpture, and the message on his phone, the root grows deeper. On his desk, the photograph of Ava and Claire stared back at him. He picked it up, studying their faces. Ava looked calm, confident, while Claire seemed distant, almost haunted. Ramsey couldn't shake the feeling that Claire knew more than she was letting on. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Claire. I need to talk to you. Now. Come to the hospital. Claire looked pale, her eyes hollow, when Ramsey arrived at her hospital room. She was sitting up in bed, clutching a sketch pad. I remembered something, she said, her voice trembling. Something Ava told me before she died. Ramsey pulled up a chair. What is it? Claire hesitated, her hands gripping the sketch pad tightly. She said the root isn't just a metaphor. It's real. It's alive. And it's connected to all of us. She said that's why she painted it. To try to sever the connection. But how could a painting sever it? Ramsey asked, leaning forward. Claire shook her head. I don't know. But Ava believed it could. She said the act of creating the painting, pouring her pain into it, was like cutting off a part of herself. She thought it would weaken the root. But the circle found out what she was doing, and they used it instead. Ramsey's mind raced. So Ava's painting wasn't just art. It was a weapon. Claire nodded. But it wasn't enough. There's something else. Something she didn't finish. She opened the sketch pad, revealing a series of drawings, fragments of a larger image. Ramsey recognized the style immediately. It was Ava's. The sketches depicted pieces of another tree, different from the one in the sculpture. Its roots were smaller, thinner, but they radiated outward, as though searching for something. This is what Ava was working on, Claire said. She called it the seed. She said it was the only way to truly destroy the root. But I don't know how to finish it. Ramsey studied the sketches, his heart pounding. Then we need to find out, he said. Because if Ava was right, this might be our only chance to stop the circle for good. The following days were a blur of research and dead ends. Ramsey and Claire pored over Ava's journals, sketches, and correspondence, searching for clues about how to complete the seed. Every piece of the puzzle seemed just out of reach, the solution buried beneath layers of symbolism and abstraction. But one thing was clear, the circle wasn't waiting for them to figure it out. A series of strange disappearances had been reported across the city, each one tied to locations where the circle had previously operated. Ramsey felt the pressure mounting. If they didn't act soon, the circle would strike again, and this time, they might succeed in unleashing the full power of the root. The city had grown restless. The disappearances linked to the Thorn Circle were no longer whispers on the fringe, they were headline news. People whispered of cults, dark rituals, and cursed art. For Detective Ramsey, the pressure to bring an end to the chaos was suffocating. But as the pieces began to fall into place, he knew one thing: to truly finish what Ava had started, he would have to confront the Circle one last time. Claire sat across from Ramsey in his apartment, her hands trembling as she flipped through Ava's journals. Scattered across the table were sketches of the Seed, their haunting imagery a stark contrast to the quiet hum of the city outside. Claire's voice broke the silence. She knew they'd try to stop her, she whispered. That's why she hid the final piece. The Seed wasn't just an idea, it was a place. Ramsey frowned, leaning closer. A place? What do you mean? Claire pointed to a page in Ava's journal, where a small map was scrawled in the margins. She mentions a garden. Somewhere outside the city. She said it was where everything began, and where it had to end. Ramsey studied the map, the crude lines leading to an area on the outskirts of Briarwood Forest. His pulse quickened. This is it, he said. This is where the Circle is regrouping. It's where they plan to finish what they started. The drive to Briarwood Forest felt endless. Ramsey and Claire sat in silence, the weight of their mission pressing down on them. Claire clutched Ava's journal against her chest, as though it were a shield. Ramsey, his hands tight on the wheel, couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. Yet he knew there was no turning back. The entrance to the garden was hidden, concealed by dense undergrowth and a wrought iron gate that had long since rusted shut. Ramsey forced it open, the screech of metal echoing through the trees. Beyond the gate lay a winding path, overgrown and choked with vines. The air grew colder as they walked, the oppressive silence broken only by the crunch of leaves underfoot. When they reached the heart of the garden, Ramsey stopped in his tracks. Before them stood a massive tree, its roots twisting and curling into the earth like veins. It was unmistakably the tree from Ava's sketches, but this one was alive. Its bark glistened as though wet, and its roots pulsed faintly, as if breathing. This is it, Claire said, her voice barely audible. This is the root. Standing at the base of the tree was Elena Rousseau, flanked by a handful of masked followers. They turned as Ramsey and Claire approached, their movements slow and deliberate. Elena's expression was one of triumph. So you found us, she said, her voice carrying easily through the still air. I suppose I should be impressed. Step away from the tree, Elena, Ramsey commanded, his gun drawn. This ends now. Elena laughed softly, shaking her head. You still don't understand, detective. The root isn't something you can end. It's life itself. Pain. Suffering. Creation. Destruction. It's everything. Ramsey's grip tightened on his weapon. Whatever you think this is, it's not going to happen. We'll burn this place to the ground if we have to. Elena's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. You can't destroy it, she said. But you can join it. That's what Ava refused to see. She thought she could sever herself from the root. But in the end, she was part of it, just like we all are. Claire stepped forward, her voice trembling but resolute. You twisted her work, she said. She wanted to destroy the root, not worship it. You turned her pain into something monstrous. Elena's gaze shifted to Claire, her expression softening for a moment. Ava was a visionary, she said. But she was also a coward. She couldn't see the beauty in what she created. But you're different. I see it in you, Claire. The same fire, the same brilliance. You could finish what she started. Don't listen to her, Ramsey said sharply, stepping in front of Claire. She's just trying to manipulate you. Elena raised her hands in a gesture of mock surrender. Believe what you like, detective. But the root doesn't care about your beliefs. It grows, whether you accept it or not. The ground beneath them trembled, the roots of the tree shifting as though alive. Ramsey's heart pounded as he felt the vibrations climb up through his boots. The air grew heavier, the oppressive energy of the place pressing against his chest. "We have to destroy it," Claire said suddenly, her voice urgent. "The seed, it's the only way." "What are you talking about?" Ramsay asked, glancing at her. Claire opened Ava's journal, flipping to a page covered in frantic sketches and notes. Ava's final work wasn't a painting. It was an act. A sacrifice. She believed that by pouring her entire being into the root, she could sever its connection to the world. But she couldn't do it alone. Elena's smile returned. "And you think you can succeed where she failed?" she asked. "You're as naive as she was." Ramsay ignored her, focusing on Claire. "What do you need to do?" Claire hesitated, her hands trembling. "I don't know if it will work," she said. "But if Ava was right, I have to give everything, my pain, my memories, my life. It's the only way to cut the root off from the rest of us." "No," Ramsay said firmly. "We'll find another way." "There is no other way," Claire said, her eyes filling with tears. "This is why Ava left the circle. She knew what it would take, and she couldn't do it. But maybe I can." The roots of the tree began to rise, curling toward them like grasping fingers. Elena and her followers stepped back, their faces alight with awe. Ramsay raised his gun, firing at the base of the tree, but the bullets had no effect. The roots continued to move, their pulsing glow growing stronger. "Claire, don't do this," Ramsay said, his voice breaking. "We'll find another way. I promise." Claire shook her head, her expression resolute. "You don't understand, Alex. I've lived in Ava's shadow my whole life. This is the only thing I can do that matters." Before Ramsay could stop her, Claire stepped forward, placing her hands on the trunk of the tree. The roots surged toward her, wrapping around her arms and legs. She let out a cry of pain, but she didn't pull away. The glow from the tree intensified, spreading up through its branches and out into the sky. Elena's triumphant laughter filled the air. "Yes," she cried. "Become one with it. Embrace the root." But Claire's voice rose above hers, filled with defiance. "No," she said. "I'm not giving it life. I'm taking it back." The glow around the tree began to flicker, its once powerful vibrations growing erratic. The roots recoiled, writhing as though in agony. The faces carved into the bark twisted, their expressions shifting from torment to something resembling peace. "No!" Elena screamed, rushing toward the tree. "You can't stop it." Ramsay intercepted her, pulling her away as the ground beneath the tree began to collapse. The roots disintegrated, turning to ash, and the oppressive energy that had filled the air vanished. The tree let out a final, mournful groan before crumbling into nothingness. When the dust settled, Claire was gone. Weeks later, Ramsay stood in the now empty garden, staring at the spot where the tree had stood. The city had returned to its uneasy normalcy, the disappearances ceasing as suddenly as they had begun. Elena and the remaining members of the Thorn Circle were in custody, but their silence offered little closure. In his hand, Ramsay held Ava's journal, its pages filled with her pain, her hope, and her final message: the root of all pain is within us. And so is the power to destroy it. As Ramsay closed the journal, he felt a faint sense of peace. Claire's sacrifice had severed the root, but her memory, and Ava's, would live on. The darkness had been pushed back, for now. But Ramsay knew that the scars it left behind would never fully heal. He turned and walked away, the garden silent once more.